And here we are again, folks, once more around the campfire with our friends, a few family members it looks like. And we're just going to tell stories and enjoy each other's company. That's what we always end up doing here. And I'll just go ahead and get it started. We've got a couple more chapters of a story I wanted to tell you. The Coyote by James Roberts. We're going to start chapter 5 again, so get settled in, get something nice to drink, and sit on down, and let's start. A capture. 3 hours after the posse scattered on their search for the coyote, spurred by thoughts of the reward of $1,000 offered by San Jacinto County and Judson Brown's declaration that the reward would be increased by the thousands more which Arizona had laid upon the fugitive's head, Rathburn smiled at the rosy dawn in supreme satisfaction. He had not lost his man's trail during the early morning hours. Time and again he had outwitted the man ahead when the latter had waited to scan his back trail for signs of pursuit. More than once he had gained ground when screened by timber growth close to the trail. Every stretch of dust-filled trail had been taken advantage of, while the soft going underfoot had deadened the sound of his horse's flying hooves. The bandit had traveled fast, and he had kept steady to the eastward. The last was what caused Rathburn to smile with satisfaction. The man for whose crime Rathburn was suspected was heading straight for Rathburn's own stomping grounds, the far distant desert range, which he knew from the low horizon in the south to the white-capped peaks in the north. To catch up with him would be but a matter of a few hours, Rathburn reflected contentedly. Nor had the posse gained upon the 2 men ahead. Brown's men, perhaps, did not have as excellent specimens of horseflesh as Rathburn and his quarry rode. Nor did they possess the trail knowledge, the tricks which Rathburn knew, and which the latter, more or less to his surprise, found that the man ahead knew. Whatever it was that caused that curling, sneering smile of contempt to play upon Rathburn's lips at intervals, it was not scorn of the riding ability of the man he was pursuing. Moreover, both men ahead were saving their horses' strength against a probable spurt by the posse at daylight. It would not be a hard matter to follow their trail by the bright light of broad day. So far as he could determine, Rathburn did not believe the man ahead of him knew that he was followed by a solitary rider who was between him and the hounds of the law. Under the circumstances, the bandit would expect to be pursued by a number, Rathburn reasoned. So he was ordering his pursuit on this theory. He did not intend to take any more time than was absolutely necessary in catching up with the man ahead. Rathburn's horse had not been hard ridden the day preceding, nor for several days before that. He had journeyed westward by easy stages, taking his time, favoring his mount, in anticipation of some unforeseen emergency, which might require hard riding, and he well knew the extraordinary powers of speed and endurance which the animal possessed. He frowned as he thought of the brand. He had not been under the impression that the iron his horse wore was generally known to the authorities. He would have to hole up somewhere in the hills before long and attend to that brand, and as it was a dead giveaway as to his identity. He could thank Brown for this bit of information anyway. With the dawn, Rathburn found it easier to keep on this man's trail without being seen himself. He gained considerably until he estimated that he was no more than 1.5 miles or 2 miles ahead at most. The sun was up when he reached the crest of the high ridge where the tall pine and the sign, which he had first seen the afternoon before. Now he hesitated, debating whether to let that printed notice remain with his penciled inscription about the Arizona reward on it, or to just tear it down. Then he saw the man he was pursuing below on the trail. He moved swiftly out of sight down the eastern side of the ridge. But when he came to the next vantage point, he discovered that the man had apparently seen him, for he was riding at a mad gallop on the trail which wound eastward along the edge of the hills. "Well, now's as good a time as any, hoss," he cried to his mount as he drove in his spurs and dashed in swift pursuit. Down the winding trail plunged horse and rider. The dun slipped and slid on the hard surface of the steep declivities and finally emerged upon the more open path which the man ahead was following. Rathburn no longer made any attempt at concealment. He was after the man ahead, and somewhere behind a posse was in mad pursuit. If he were captured before he could overtake the bandit who was responsible for the robbery, the latter would very likely escape, was certain to make his getaway, in fact. Rathburn called upon his horse by voice and spur for all the speed there was in him. He could see the fugitive ahead urging his horse to its utmost. The race was on in earnest. Thus they came to a long stretch of open level trail, and here Rathburn's horse began slowly to gain. The man ahead turned in his saddle, and Rathburn saw the glint of sunlight on dull metal. He brought out his own gun, but the other did not fire. He kept on, half turned in the saddle, watching his pursuer keenly. Rathburn continued to gain upon him. They were now less than a half-mile apart, and the fugitive suddenly turned his horse due north, straight toward the hills, and sent a volley of shots whistling in the pursuer's direction. Rathburn held his fire. The bullets flew wide of their mark, and he could see his man reloading as he rode. Rathburn now cut across, racing for the point where he thought the other would reach the hills. His horse rose to the emergency with a tremendous burst of speed. He was close enough now to shoot with a reasonable certainty of scoring a hit on his flying target. But he had no desire to kill him, and he could not be certain at that distance of merely wounding his quarry. He also recoiled from the thought that he might accidentally hit the other's splendid horse. Now just ahead, a thin line of straggling pines ranged down the gradual slope from the first low ridge on the hills for which they were riding. Rathburn swung north and gained the shelter of this screen just as the other rider began a firing. The trees were now between them, and each was an equal distance from the gentle slope of the ridge. Rathburn called upon his horse for a last heartbreaking burst of speed, and the dun made good. At the beginning of the slope to the ridge, Rathburn veered sharply to the right, burst through the trees a scant rod or two from his man. His gun was leveled straight at the other, and he'd been caught momentarily off his guard. "Drop it!" shouted Rathburn, racing toward him. The man's right hand fell to his side while he checked his horse with his left. Rathburn rode in close to him, and they came to a halt. Rathburn's lips were curled in a smile of contempt. The other stared at him, white-faced, his eyes wide and inquiring. The fingers of his right hand relaxed, and the gun fell to the ground. Rathburn swung low in the saddle and scooped it up, thrusting it into a pocket of his coat. "Now beat it up over that ridge ahead," Rathburn ordered, "and be quick about it. A posse may be closing behind us." The other's eyes lit up with surprise. You're not an officer?" he stammered. "Shut up, you fool," cried Rathburn. "You want to stay here and talk when there's a score or two of men after us? I'm worse than an officer. Slope for that ridge now. Hurry." The man put the steel to his horse, and they dashed up the slope, crossed the ridge, and found themselves in a thick growth of timber, which covered a large area. "Now pick your way into the middle of that pitch of timber," snapped out Rathburn, "and don't forget I'll be right close behind you. Get going and don't gape." The captive's face flushed at the other's manner and the indubitable note of contempt in his voice, but he obeyed the instructions and pushed into the timber. When they had proceeded some distance, Rathburn called a halt. "Ever been in this country before?" he demanded with a sneer. Yes. The other was more composed now. He studied his captor curiously and seemed more at ease. Evidently, he was heartened by the fact that Rathburn had said he was not an officer, and he believed him. "Now I suppose you're after what I'm carrying on me," he said with a touch of bitterness. "I guess I'd have had a much better chance as I've got now if I'd have started shooting even after you got the drop on me." Rathburn laughed harshly. "You never had a chance from the start. If you only knew it. Why, you upstart, you're not entitled to any chance. The other man's darkened in a swift anger. "Brave talk," he said sneeringly. "You've got me where you want me, so you can say anything." "I've got a pile to say," replied Rathburn shortly, "but this isn't the time or the place to say it. We want to be good and away out of that posse's path, and quick." "Well, you might as well take what you're after, and then each of us can look out for himself," was the hot retort. Rathburn looked at the man quizzically. "You've got more spunk than I thought," he mused. He stared at the other man closely. The bandit could not have been more than 25 or 26. Now, he was tall, he was well built, and he was blond. His hair and his eyes were about the color of Rathburn's. But Rathburn particularly noted the man's face, and whatever it was he saw there caused him to shrug and frown deeply. "What's your name?" he demanded coldly. "Percy," sneeringly replied the other. "Well, that's good enough for me," said Rathburn cheerfully. "All I need is a name to call you. Now, Percy, if you're acquainted with this here country and here and can steer the way to where the posse'll be liable to overlook us, you better be leading on. I see you've ditched your other gun somewhere. You had two. So you want me to take you where you'll be safe so you can rob me, maybe shoot me down, and then make your getaway?" the other accused. Rathburn looked him straight in the eyes. "Now, if you think I'm a kind of man who'd shoot another down in cold blood when he was helpless, well, you don't know much about human beings," he said slowly. "I have no intention of murdering you or harming you at all. If you're halfway careful, if you feel that it's against your principles to lead this expedition to temporary safety, why, we can turn back towards Dry Lake. We're going to do one thing or the other within 1 minute." "Ah, come on," muttered the captive. He led the way through the timber to its western edge. Then he turned north in the shelter of the trees, traversing a long, high, rocky ridge. "Yeah, our horses won't leave any tracks here," he called back. "Or maybe you don't care whether we leave any tracks or not," he added sarcastically. Rathburn spurred his horse alongside of him. "It doesn't make a bit of difference to me," he said. "You're the one that's got to be scared of that posse, Percy, not me. If it wasn't for one thing, I'd take you right down there to meet him." The other looked at him both in anger and perplexity. "Suppose you'd object to telling what that one thing is?" he said savagely. "Well, it may be that I feel sorry for you," said Rathburn, as if to himself, "and may be that I want credit for bringing you in without the help of any posse and without them knowing it." Chapter 6, The Real Lowdown. They rode on in silence. When they reached the north end of the ridge, the man in the lead turned west on the slope, studded with large boulders and rock outcroppings. There was considerable shale here, too, and they had to proceed cautiously in spots, both for fear of sliding down the shale and to prevent making any noise. "If they followed us up here, we can hear 'em before they get to us," said the man, who called himself Percy, with a shrug and a frowning look at his companion. Rathburn did not reply. They continued across the slope and descended into a large bowl or pocket, guarded by huge boulders and scattering trees on the slope above. "I guess it's safe to rest our horses here," said Percy. "We can hear 'em coming either way, but I don't think they'll get up here." However, neither he nor Rathburn knew how many men Brown had at his command, nor did they know that the sheriff of the county, with 2 deputies, had raced to Dry Lake by automobile, procured horses, and hastened to join Brown on the east trail, which seemed the most likely route of escape for the outlaw. There was a spring in the pocket, surrounded by a small meadow of good grass. The pair watered their horses, loosened their saddle cinches, and permitted the animals to graze with reins dangling. Rathburn took his slicker pack from the rear of the saddle and spread it open on the ground. "Reckon it's safe to build a small fire here?" he asked cheerfully. "I'm powerful hungry, and I got some emergency provisions, being trail broke." Percy, too, was hungry, as his eager look towards the pack testified. "I'll climb up to the top on the lower side and keep an eye out while you fix some grub," he volunteered. "You needn't be scared of me jumping over the other side. There's a drop of Geez, about 500 feet over there. Go ahead and jump if you want, said Rathburn. Me, I'd rather live. That's why I want to eat. While the other climbed to his lookout position, Rathburn made a fire. Then he took a small frying pan and coffee pot, minus its handle, from the pack, removed the packages stuffed in them, and soon was making coffee, frying some bacon, and warming up some beans. This, with some hard biscuits and some syrup out of a bottle, constituted their meal, which Rathburn soon had ready. Again he looked closely at Percy's face as the latter scrambled down from his perch to appease his hunger. Suddenly he burst out laughing, but it was a belittling laugh, half sneering, which brought the blood to the face of the captive while Rathburn watched him closely. If I had today's actions to do over again, you mightn't be so tickled, said the man viciously. Now I'm laughing to think how lucky you are for a rank beginner and a botcher, said Rathburn as they began to eat. You must have took a course in outlawing from some correspondence school, he continued. Well, maybe you could have done better, hinted the other. Quite likely I could, admitted Rathburn. In the first place, I'd have shut that back door after I came in so nobody could pot-shot me from behind. Yeah, I reckon I'd have done that. Percy glared at him thoughtfully. Then I wouldn't have let myself get in line with the front and the side windows, Rathburn taunted. Lots of men are shot through windows. Ever hear of such a thing? Now his listener didn't answer. And now that I think of it, Rathburn droned on, I'd have lined those men up against the wall with their faces turned away from me. That puts them at more of a disadvantage, and why they can't see what's going on. Percy now was regarding him keenly. Let's see, said Rathburn with tantalizing slowness. Oh, yes, Percy. I wouldn't have taken anything from the cash drawers but the bills. Now, I don't like to take the time to monkey around with a lot of silver. Besides, it sort of weighs one down. He paused long enough to let that sink in, then he continued. The thing I'd have paid most of my attention to, excepting for keeping a watchful eye on the men against the wall and the windows and the doors, would have been the safe. See, the big money's usually in the safe, and the bartender can be induced to open the safe just as easy as he can be persuaded into the opening of cash drawers. And say, Percy, I'd never let a bartender get as close to me as you let that feller get to you. He might start something, then you'd have to begin shooting, and that would alarm the town and ball up the whole program. Now, you talk like you've had considerable experience, observed Percy warily. Maybe so. Maybe I have. But if I have, I can say I've never pulled anything quite so raw as the way you pulled that stunt last night down in Dry Lake, Percy. Why, that's the real lowdown on that. You just naturally laid yourself open to attack from all quarters. His captive looked at him respectfully and sheepishly. And there's only one reason why you got away with it, said Rathburn, his eyes narrowing. Because I was lucky, like you say, I suppose, sneered Percy. No, thundered Rathburn. You got away with it because they thought you were the Coyote. The captive started, stared at Rathburn with widened eyes. That's why you got away with it, continued Rathburn in a hard voice. And you thought you'd cinch it when you told them before you went out that they could tell their funny judge, you called. Rathburn's eyes blazed with angry contempt. Trading on somebody else's name, he mocked. Trying to make out you was the goods, and I believe they thought you was the Coyote at that. Man, I saw the whole dirty business. Percy's face went white. However, his emotion was more anger than fear, and he was prey to an overpowering curiosity. How do you know I ain't the Coyote? He asked shrewdly. Rathburn stared at him, stunned. Then he leapt to his feet, and his gun flashed into his hand in a movement too swift for the eye to follow. Get over there and look at that brand on my horse, he commanded. Remember how that printed bill read that put it in your full head to try and masquerade as the Coyote? And then we read the brand on that horse. The captive rose and without to look back walked to where Rathburn's horse was cropping the grass. The left side of the animal was toward him, and for a few moments he stood looking with bulging eyes at the C-2 on the shoulder. Then he turned slowly. Rathburn's gaze burned into him, but a cool, deliberate light had come into his eyes. "So you're the Coyote," Percy said quietly. "I should have recognized you." "Yep, I'm called the Coyote," said Rathburn, walking slowly toward him. "I'm the man they think robbed that joint down in Dry Lake last night. I'm the man they're looking for. I'm the man they want to make pay for your burgling work. And that's the way it's gone for 3 years, Percy. I've been blamed for job after job that I didn't even know was pulled off till I heard they were looking for me on account of it. But this is one job they'll not be able to lay at my door, for I've got the man who's responsible, and I've got him red-handed." "And what are you going to do about that?" asked the other coolly. Again, Rathburn's eyes blazed with rage. "Do? Why, I'm just naturally going to take you all in by my lonesome and turn you over to the sheriff with my compliments." Rathburn cooled down as he said this, and drew tobacco and papers from his shirt pocket, proceeded to build him a cigarette. Then he looked at the man queerly. "And now I reckon you know why I ain't got any idea of taking that money off of you," he said. "Well, they might not believe you," returned the other. "I know what you mean. You mean they might think I was putting up a job on them and trying to shift the blame on somebody else. It can't be done, Percy. Listen to this. I was looking through the front window of that place last night when you held it up. 2 men that work in the hotel down there come along and looked in alongside of me after I warned them not to go in. I showed them this scar on my arm." He rolled back his left sleeve, disclosing a scar on the forearm about 3 inches below the elbow. "I told him that scar was made by a bullet from the Coyote's gun," Rathburn went on, pulling down his sleeve and drawing his right hand back to the gun he had replaced in its holster. "That scar was made by the Coyote's gun. I shot myself in the arm by accident some few years ago. Now here's the point. Those men will remember me and remember that scar. The description the sheriff of that county might have in his office will tell all about that scar. It won't be hard to identify me by it and the 2 men that stood out there in the window with me. So they'll know I didn't pull the robbery." The other man shifted uneasy on his feet. "And that ain't all, Percy," Rathburn continued. "Somebody saw me running up the street afterwards because they took a couple of shots at me for luck. That'll dovetail with my story. Now, I've never been known to use 2 guns, and if they want any more proof, all they have to do will be to stand you up in front of the men you had in line, dressed as you are with the black handkerchief over your face. That'll settle it. I reckon the sheriff will believe me and give me a chance when he hears the facts. Or I may not wait long for a talk with him." "I take it you've got me right," said the captive, compressing his lips. "But if you're really the Coyote I've heard so much about, you'll give me my gun and give me a chance to run for it." Rathburn's laugh jarred on his ears. "Give you a chance and take a chance myself of going to the gallows?" "The gallows!" exclaimed the other. "Oh, I see. But didn't you say you thought the sheriff would give you a chance if he met you and heard your story, and that you don't have to stay around and get taken back to Arizona now?" "They hang men in this state," Rathburn interred. "But there wasn't," the other man faltered, staring. "One of those shots," he fired at the lamp, went wild, or glanced off of something. And Rathburn lifted his brow significantly. "Killed somebody?" cried the other. He staggered back just as a rattle of fallen stones signified that horsemen were in the shale on the slope to the eastward. Chapter 7. Where to Hide. For the space of several seconds, Rathburn and his captive looked into each other's eyes. Rathburn's gaze was keen, alert, fired by the quick thinking he was doing. Stark terror showed in the other's eyes, which gradually changed to one of a haunting fear and indecision. Then his eyes became clear, and he returned Rathburn's glance, cool and questioning. "Get your horse," ordered Rathburn, running to his own mount. In a twinkling he had tightened his cinch, caught up the reins, and vaulted into the saddle. His captive was at his side shortly afterwards. "You're still in the lead," Rathburn snapped out, "unless you want to wait for him." The other whirled his horse and sent him flying for the western end of the pocket, with Rathburn close behind. They went up a steep, rocky trail screened by boulders. When they reached the top of the west rim, they looked back and saw 4 horsemen on the shale slope leading to the pocket. Brown evidently had split up his posse, and he was literally combing the hills for his quarry. "Well, they'll know they're on the right trail when they see the remains of our dinner and my pack down there," remarked Rathburn dryly. "But they haven't seen us yet," said Percy breathlessly. "If we can make Sunrise Canyon Trail, we can lose them in the mountains. That is, if you want to lose them." "Where's the trail?" asked Rathburn. "About 5 miles west. It's the only trail going up into the big mountains between here and the other side of the Dry Lake Range, and it's a tough one." Rathburn quickly sized up the country ahead, and he saw low and high ridges with towering mountains to the right or the north of them. They were scattering pines on the slopes and patches of timbers in the wide ravine, many of which were veritable valleys. "We'll run for it while they're getting in and out of that hole," he suddenly decided with a click of his teeth. Their horses were in no better shape than ours. "Slope along." The other had dug in his spurs even before he got the order. They rode swiftly down the steep trail from the rim of the pocket and fled across an open space and up the slope of the first ridge. Rathburn looked back as they crossed it, but he could see no sign of their pursuers. His face was still troubled. His gaze kept boring into the back of the man on the horse ahead of him. At times he muttered to himself. They galloped up the hard bed of a dry arroyo. They swung westward across another rock-bound ridge, picking their way carefully among the boulders. Rathburn's face became more and more strained as he noted that the leader evidently knew the country they were in like a book. Rathburn, with the experience born of years spent in open places, was able to keep his bearings. They had followed a course for some miles north of the main trail leading east, the trail by which they first came into this locality. Then they had doubled back westward, some miles above that trail of course, and now they were heading almost due north again, in the direction of the mountains, which did not appear to be far away. He surmised that they were nearly directly north of the ranch where he had that meal with that girl and that boy. Now at the top of the next ridge his guide pointed above him. "You see that crack in the mountain?" he said. Rathburn nodded as he made out what appeared to be a gash in the steep side of the mountain north of him. "That's Sunrise Canyon," said the other quietly. "There's a trail up that canyon into the heart of the mountains where they couldn't catch us. Or you, if you want to go alone. In 100 years. He stared steadily at Rathburn. "Mosey along, then," said Rathburn. "Let's get somewheres before our horses drop." They kept along the ridge until it was cut by a canyon, and here they descended and entered another long, narrow ravine, which they negotiated at a gallop. At its upper end they again climbed a steep slope. Their horses were showing the strain of the hours of hard riding. Rathburn realized that they could go but a limited distance, but the members of the posse most assuredly must be in the same fix so far as their mounts were concerned. He decided that if they could get into the canyon unseen, they would be able to rest their horses and remain secure for the night. Next morning they would continue on up into the hills or slip back by a roundabout way to Dry Lake. His lips froze into a thin white line. He did not look at the man with him as they paused for a few moments under the trees which covered the top of the ridge and gazed at a long, gently sloping stretch of nearly open country. See, it was covered with clumps of trees at intervals that reached to the dark, narrow openings in the mountains, marking the entrance to the Sunrise Canyon and the trail to the fastnesses of the higher hills. "You can swing off here to the left and down a wide valley to where there's a cutoff into Dry Lake," he heard his captive's suggestion. "I don't see any sense in all this hard riding and hiding if you're going to turn me in." "We'll go on," growlingly replied Rathburn. They descended the ridge and entered the long sloping valley, so wide that it virtually was a plain. They made good headway, although they favored their horses. They took advantage of the shelter provided by an occasional clump of pines. The afternoon was drawing to a close, with the sun dipping sharply toward the western hills when they came in sight of the entrance to the canyon. But with the first glimpse, they checked their horses and turned into the shelter of some trees nearby. Beat us to it, exclaimed Percy. 4 of 'em, said Rathburn, frowning. Brown ain't liking any chances. He's a better man than I figured him out. And there's more of 'em. He pointed westward, where 2 riders were barely discernible on the crest of the ridge. They disappeared almost immediately in the timber below. Well, we'll turn back, Rathburn decided. We'll ride with the trees between us and the men up the canyon and keep an eye out for the pair to the west. You might watch that side, and I'll look out for the east and the south. Come on, let's drift. The face of the man who called himself Percy was white and strained as they urged their tired mounts southward. They skirted the western end of the ridge by which they had gained the wide valley and continued on, carefully scanning the landscape in all directions for indications of pursuit. It was plain to them that they had been seen to leave the east trail early that morning. Brown and his men undoubtedly knew that they had headed north, and the justice had immediately dispatched men to guard the entrance to the canyon trail into the mountains. Then they had begun a systematic search of the locality. This deduction was strengthened when Rathburn suddenly pointed towards the east. More riders were to be seen on the slope of the valley's side in that direction. Even as they looked, those riders too disappeared from view as they dropped down behind the rise of ground. The sun was going down fast. Already the red banners of the sunset were flaunted in the high western skies. The twilight would be upon them a space, the long-lasting purple-veiled twilight of the altitudes. Then the night would close down with its canopy of stars. Rathburn looked speculatively at his companion. We'll make a break for that clump of trees about a quarter mile ahead with everything our horses have got left, he said, driving in his spurs. In a last mad dash which taxed every iota of strength and endurance left in their beasts, they gained the shelter of the little patch of timber. And here we'll wait, said Rathburn coolly as he dismounted. What? Cried the other, staring at him incredulously. We ain't quite surrounded yet. We haven't seen anybody in the south. That way may be open and it's liable to be closed while we're staying here. Get off your horse and unsaddle him, commanded Rathburn sternly. The best place to hide from a posse is in the middle of it. Chapter 8. 2 Weird Moves. The captive complied with the orders, looking at Rathburn in a peculiar way, half disgusted, half contemptuous. Indeed, he turned his back on the other, leaned against the slender trunk of a pine, stared steadily into the south. He appeared much worried. The horses, now, welcomed the chance to rest. Rathburn walked slowly back and forth the width of the patch of timber, vigilantly keeping watch. He paid no attention whatsoever to the man leaning against the tree. For all the interest he displayed, he might have completely forgotten his very existence. In time, this got on the other's nerves. I believe you lied when you said there was a man killed down there last night, he said coolly. I didn't say anybody was killed, Rathburn returned without looking in his direction. Why, you just assumed that part of it. Well, then you wanted me to think so, said the other in a loud voice. You was trying to throw a scare into me. Rathburn swung on his heel and stepped squarely in front of him. I let you think that to show you what might have happened, he said. Such things have happened to me and swelled the price on my head. Now, darn you, if you talk that loud again, I'm going to choke your wind off. The words came with a sinister earnestness, but they seemed to rouse some dormant strain of extraordinary courage in the man to whom they was addressed. He suddenly leaped from the tree and struck out with all his force at his command, but Rathburn had anticipated the attack. He knocked the other's blow aside and drove his right square to the jaw. Now there's a little souvenir to show you that I mean business, Percy. Percy came back to the attack with eyes gleaming with malice. Again he attempted to hit Rathburn, but the latter stepped aside with lightning swiftness and drove home another blow. He followed it up with a left and a right, and Percy sprawled his length on the grass. After some time he sat up, dazed. Rathburn was standing over him. But although he realized fully that he was not a match for Rathburn in physical combat, and doubtless was greatly his inferior with his gun, his spirit was undaunted. You better finish me or drag me in, he gritted, for I'll get you if I can. I don't know what your play is, but you've acted too weird today for me to believe you're on the square one way or the other. You want some more, Percy? My name is Lamy, growlingly replied the other as he rose cautiously. Oh, Percy Lammy. No, not just Lammy. Lammy's my name and I ain't ashamed of it. You'll find it out, sooner or later, anyway, I expect. He stammered during this speech as if he had just remembered something. Remembered when it was too late. Rathburn noted the frown and the confused expression in Lamy's eyes. He turned abruptly and walked away. A few minutes later he came back to find Lamy sitting with his back to a tree, staring unseeingly into the deepening twilight. Lammy, he said harshly, we're going to get away from this posse, maybe. Anyway, soon it's dark, we'll ride south. It's just possible we can leave 'em up here in the hills. Now, suppose I refuse to go. Then I'll have to truss you up and tie you to your horse, and don't think I won't do it. The ring of menace in Rathburn's voice convinced the other, but he made no comment. When darkness had fallen, they saddled their mounts, and they started out. They rode at a jog, keeping as much as possible in the shadows of the timber. Rathburn noticed the valley gradually widened. He showed interest in his surroundings. Then, off to the left below them, he saw moving shadows. He called a halt at the next clump of trees. Lammy, are there any horses running in here that you know of? There probably are, said Lammy sarcastically, and they probably got riders on them. No doubt, returned Rathburn gravely. Well, I just saw some shadows that looked like horses down to the left of us. I expected they'd shut us off in the south, snapped out Lammy. You gave 'em plenty of time. Well, we just naturally had to rest our horses, observed Rathburn, and as it is, we're not good for far, nor for any fast riding, and besides, I've changed my mind some since this morning. So, I suppose you're going to give me a chance? Sneeringly inquired the other. He could see Rathburn's eyes in the twilight, and suddenly he shifted in his saddle uneasily. For Rathburn's gaze had narrowed, and it shot from his eyes blue steel with a flash of fire. His face had set in cold, grim lines. The whole nature of the man seemed to undergo a change. He radiated menace, contempt, cold resentment. The corners of his mouth twisted down sharply. His voice, as he spoke now, seemed edged like a knife. Lammy, hand over that money. Lammy's eyes lifted in swift comprehension. A look of cunning came into his eyes, followed by a gleam of hope, not unmixed with derision. He thrust his hands into his coat pockets and held out bills and silver to Rathburn, who stuffed the plunder into his own pockets. That all of it? Demanded Rathburn sharply. He made no effort to temper the tone of his voice. For answer, Lammy dug into his trousers pocket under his chaps and produced 2 more rolls of bills. That's the chunk, he said with a sneering inflection in his voice. If you want, I'll stand a frisk. No, I won't search you. I take it you're too sensible to lie. Thanks, replied Lammy dryly. I suppose I'm free to go now, unless you figure you'd be safer by killing me off. Anger, swift and uncontrollable, leaped into Rathburn's eyes. Then he laughed, softly and mirthlessly. If I'd been minded to do for you, or had any such an idea in my head, I'd have given it to you long before this, he said. It's lucky for you, Lammy, that I'm pretty much the breed that you thought I was. Don't pose, reported Lammy hotly. You intended to get that money and make me the goat if you could from the very start. If you'd had any idea of turning me over to Brown, you'd have done that little thing too, long before this. Maybe so, Rathburn mused, staring at the other thoughtfully in the dim light of the stars. Maybe I will yet. You're not out of this, and neither am I. Those shadows down to the left are getting plainer. What's that long, dark streak over there on the right? Those are trees, answered Lammy sneeringly. Well, let's make for 'em, ordered Rathburn. Don't forget you're still under orders, Lammy, and don't overlook the fact that I'm more or less in earnest about things in general, he added significantly. They rode at a tangent for the dark shadow of the trees. At the edge of the timber ensued Another long wait, and Rathburn, uncommunicative, moodily paced restlessly back and forth. The horses had another excellent opportunity to rest, and the fagged-out animals took advantage of it. Once or twice, Rathburn thought he glimpsed a light far down the valley, but he couldn't be sure. Neither could he be sure he saw the moving shadows on the opposite side of the wide valley again. The night wore into early morning, and the moon added its cold radiance to the faint glow of the myriads of stars. Rathburn sensed the nearness of enemies. Several times he stopped before Lammy, who sat upon his saddle blanket with his back against a tree trunk and dozed. Rathburn had to fight off continual drowsiness. For long hours he had walked along the edge of the pines. He dared not trust himself to sleep. He dared not trust Lammy to stand guard while he obtained some rest. And he knew that when the sun came up and the day began, he would be thoroughly awake again. For more than once he had gone 2 nights without sleep. Now also he assumed that the hunt would be less spirited during the night. Members of the posse would themselves be drowsy, but they would spell each other and in that way maintain their vigil and secure a few hours of rest. Rathburn's rage rose at frequent intervals as he thought of the predicament he was in through no fault of his own. More than once he glared malevolently at the sleeping Lammy. Then the troubled look would come again to his eyes, and he would resume his pacing, muttering to himself, staring into the blue veil of the night. Once he sat down and removed his right boot and sock in the darkness. Shortly afterward he again began his pacing. He felt the pangs of hunger and shook his head savagely as he thought of the scanty supply of provisions he had been compelled to leave in the mountain pocket. His spirits revived as he thought of the horses. They would be fresh in the morning, and he intended that his horse should have a grain feed that day. Rathburn always thought of his horse first, and although it might seem that he taxed the animal's powers to their utmost at times, he never went beyond a certain point. He had often said that he would surrender to his pursuers rather than kill his mount in evading them. The first faint glimmer of the dawn was lighting the skies above the ridges to the eastward when he roused Lammy. He woke with a start, stared sleepily at Rathburn, then got speedily to his feet. "You been awake all night?" he asked curiously. Rathburn nodded, looking at him closely. "Saddle up," he ordered. They rode southward at a canter in the shelter of the edge of the timber. When the eastern skies were rosy red and fast changing to gold, the advent of the sun, they saw 2 things. A small ranch house about a mile southeast of them, and 2 riders some distance to the north. Rathburn reined in his mount. He looked at Lammy, who met his gaze in defiance. Then Rathburn reached into his coat pocket with his right hand and drew out a gun. "Here's your shooting iron," he said as he held the weapon out to Lammy. The other stared at him in astonishment. "Take it," snapped out Rathburn. "Take it, or I may change my mind." Lammy took the gun wonderingly, balanced it for a moment in his hand, and shoved it into his holster. Rathburn motioned towards the south, and Lammy rode along at this side. They caught another glimpse of the horsemen in the north, and as they drew opposite the ranch house on the west or the front side, they saw a woman leave it and walk that short distance to the barn, enter. At that moment, both Rathburn and Lammy gave vent to low exclamations. They had caught sight of riders in the south and to the east, and they appeared to be surrounded by the posse. Rathburn looked at Lammy soberly. However, it was Lammy who spoke first. "You said the best place to hide from a posse was in the middle of it," he said scornfully. "Why not leave the horses in the timber and run for the house? Maybe it has a cellar." "Well, I reckon that would be as good a move as any," replied Rathburn to the other's surprise. "I'm game if you are." Lammy's eyes flamed with excitement as he turned his mount to a tree. They came to what looked like a bear pit or a prospect hole. It was partly filled with brush. "We can hide our saddles in there and let the horses go," Lammy suggested. "There's a few horses running in through here, and they may join them." "Well, you can do that with yours," said Rathburn grimly. "You seem to forget that the brand on this dun is pretty well known." He coolly tied his horse as Lammy followed his own suggestion, hid his saddle, and turned his mount loose. They moved back to the edge of the timber and waited till they could see no one inside about the house or in any direction in the valley. Then they started on a run for the house. Well, that's what they're doing, is they're running in general. Doesn't look too good for them. They're kind of surrounded. And we'll see. We got much more to tell you about this here story, and so next time I get you around this campfire, I'll tell you some more of it. And until then, you enjoy yourselves, and I'll see you next time here around the campfire. Clay Steele. Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the B-itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some B-itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.